The hall was enormous. It stretched so far up toward the ceiling that the top of it was lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with rows of curved seats, each one filled with a delegate from one of the 41 member species of the Interstellar Council. The air smelled faintly of something chemical, something that had no name in any human language, and the lights overhead were a pale, cold blue that made every face in the room look a little unwell. And Nathan Cole sat in the human delegations section, which was near the back, as it always was. The human seats were smaller than those of the Keth Ari and set slightly lower, a detail that had been called an architectural accident the first time anyone complained about it and had never been corrected. Nathan was 57 years old. He had gray at his temples and a calm face that people often mistook for tiredness. He was not tired. He was simply a man who had learned a long time ago that showing too much on your face in a room like this one was a mistake. Beside him sat Laura Briggs. She was 29, sharp in the way that people are when they have been underestimated for most of their lives, and she was writing something on a small pad in her lap with a steady hand. She had not looked up since the session started. The Keth Ari delegate, Vreth Un, was speaking, so he always spoke as though he expected to be interrupted and was already annoyed about it. He was tall, pale-skinned, with long fingers that moved constantly when he talked, tapping the air to mark his points. He was the senior speaker of the council, and he had held that role for 11 years, and in all that time, he had never said a kind word about humanity in any official record. The item on the table was a human proposal. It had been submitted 6 weeks earlier by Nathan's office, and it was a framework for emergency aid to the Duvari border worlds, where 2 council species had been fighting a slow war for 9 years, and where the civilian population, which belonged to neither species, had been largely abandoned. The proposal asked the council to establish a shared relief fund and a neutral medical presence. It was 40 pages long. It had taken 8 months to write. Vreth Un had been speaking about it for 4 minutes. He called it sentimental. That he called it an example of human government's confusing emotion with policy. He said, with a thin smile that got a ripple of laughter from several delegations, that it was a touching reminder of why humanity had never been given a seat on any of the council's senior committees. The laughter was not cruel, exactly. It was the kind of laughter that happens when a group of people have agreed, without ever saying so out loud, that a certain other group does not quite count. Nathan listened to all of it. His expression did not change. When Vreth Un finished, the floor was opened for response. Nathan stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. A few delegates were still murmuring to each other, and one group near the left wall was not paying attention at all. Nathan waited until the noise settled on its own. Then he straightened his jacket, reached into the front pocket, and took out a small data chip. It was gray and unremarkable, the kind used for standard file transfers. He walked to the central dais. It was a raised platform at the center of the floor, ringed by recording equipment where official declarations were made. It was not usually where a junior delegation's ambassador went to speak. Nathan stepped up onto it anyway. He placed the chip on the surface of the dais. He folded his hands in front of him. He said, in a clear and even voice, that humanity was formally withdrawing its membership from the Interstellar Council. The withdrawal would take effect in 30 standard days, in accordance with Article 9 of the Council Charter. All human diplomatic staff, military liaisons, engineering personnel, and contracted workers would be recalled to human-administered space within that window. The embassy offices on Verath Prime would be vacated and returned to council property management in good condition. And he thanked the council for 60 years of membership. He stepped down from the dais and walked back to his seat. There was a pause of about 3 seconds. Then the room broke into laughter, not the polite, dismissive kind from before. This was genuine, open, wide laughter. Delegates leaned over to each other and exchanged words. Vreth Un actually held one long hand over his mouth, which was the Keth Ari equivalent of grinning. A delegate from the Shorvani section, and a quieter species who usually kept to themselves, did not laugh, but most of the others did. Someone near the back called out something that the translation system rendered as, "The short ones are having feelings again," and that got a second wave of laughter. Nathan sat down. Laura had stopped writing. She was looking at the room with an expression that was very still and very flat, the kind of expression that takes effort to hold. "They're not going to take it seriously," she said quietly. No," Nathan said. "Does it matter?" Nathan looked at the data chip still sitting on the dais. No one had picked it up. It sat there small and plain under the cold blue lights while the laughter continued around it. "Not even a little," he said. The session chair eventually called the room to order and moved on to the next item. The human withdrawal was not debated. It was not put to a vote. It was not assigned to a committee. It was, for all practical purposes, treated as a joke that had already run its course. By the time the session ended, 2 alien news networks had already filed brief, amused reports. One described it as a theatrical display from the Council's least consequential member species. The other simply used a phrase that translated loosely as crying and leaving. Nathan spent the rest of the afternoon in the embassy. He sat at his desk, wrote a short message, encrypted it with a standard diplomatic key, and sent it on a direct channel back to Earth. The message was not long. It said that the announcement had been made and received as expected. It said the 30-day clock had started. And it said 3 words that had been agreed on in advance as a signal: begin the withdrawal. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went to help Laura carry files to the packing crates. They worked quietly and without hurry, the way people do when they have already made up their minds about something and there is nothing left to decide, only work left to finish. Outside the windows of the embassy, the station turned slowly against the stars, and the council's great hall blazed with light, full of species who had spent the evening laughing and had not yet begun to wonder what exactly they had just agreed to lose. Carl Avery was not a dramatic man. He ran the Human Logistics and Integration Bureau from a mid-sized office in Columbus, Ohio, on the 4th floor of a building that had a broken elevator and a coffee machine that only worked if you hit it on the left side. He wore plain shirts and kept his desk very clean, and when people asked him what he did for a living, he usually said coordination work, because explaining the real answer took too long. On the morning after Nathan Cole's announcement, Carl arrived at his office at 7:45, hit the coffee machine on the left side, poured himself a cup, sat down at his desk, and opened the withdrawal checklist. It was very long. It had taken his team 4 years to build, not because the work was complicated in any single part, but because humanity had been quietly woven into the Council's infrastructure for 6 decades, and unwinding that required care. You could not simply pull a thread. You had to find every place it connected to something else first, or you would cause damage. Carl's team had been meticulous about this. They had mapped every connection. They knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what order to do it in. Carl circled the first item on the list and got to work. Across human space, others were doing the same. Engineers received transfer orders and began shutting down consoles they had maintained for years. Supply officers closed accounts. Medical staff collected equipment and filed their last patient handover reports in triplicate, following every protocol to the letter. There were no dramatic exits. There were no speeches at the door. People simply finished what they were doing, made sure everything was properly documented, and left. Diana Osei was one of the last people Nathan had messaged personally. She ran the Deep Space Relay Division, which was responsible for 94 communications arrays spread across the Outer Council territories. The arrays were not glamorous. They were large metal structures anchored at key gravitational points between star systems, and they existed to carry signals across distances that would otherwise make communication nearly impossible. They had been built over 30 years by human engineers working in shifts, often in conditions that no other Council species had volunteered for. The Council had approved their construction and then largely forgotten about them, the way people forget about the pipes in the walls of a building they live in. Diana had been maintaining those arrays for 11 years. She read Nathan's message twice, then forwarded the decommissioning orders to her 12 regional teams with a single line of her own attached. Do it right. Every step. No shortcuts. Her teams understood what she meant. It was not about making the council suffer. It was about maintaining the standard that human engineers had always maintained, even when no one was watching and no one was saying thank you. They would shut everything down properly. They would file proper closure reports. They would leave the physical structures intact in case the council found someone else to run them someday. They just would not be there anymore. By day 8 of the 30-day window, the first problems started showing up at the edges of council space. The cargo fleet operated by the HFY found that 3 of its standard navigation beacons were offline. The beacons had always been there. They had been there so reliably and for so long that the fleet's navigation computers had simply assumed they would always be there and had not been updated with alternative routing. The fleet sat in position for 11 hours while its operators tried to work out what had happened. On day 10, a medical outpost on the second Duvari border, the same border that Nathan's rejected proposal had been trying to help, sent a distress call. The human staff were gone. The equipment was still there, clean and functional, with instructions posted on every surface in 6 languages. But the local staff, who had worked alongside the human doctors for years, had never been trained to operate the more advanced diagnostic systems, because the human doctors had always been there to do it, and nobody had ever thought to ask what would happen if they weren't. On day 12, a data processing hub on the Keth-Ari trade corridor simply stopped receiving the maintenance updates it had been getting automatically from a human-operated server for 22 years. Nobody at the hub knew what the server did exactly. It had just always worked. The system started degrading slowly, the way systems do when they are no longer being tended. Not with a crash, but with a quiet accumulation of small errors that would eventually add up to something serious. Sek Aro noticed. Sek Aro was Vreth Un's junior aide, and he was not very senior, and nobody paid much attention to what he said in meetings. But he was careful and observant, and over the course of 4 days he had been quietly collecting the incident reports that various council departments were filing and trying to see if there was a pattern. There was a very clear pattern. On every failing system, every offline beacon, every outpost without staff, all of it traced back to human-operated assets that were being methodically withdrawn on the schedule Nathan Cole had announced from the dais. Sek Aro put together a report. It was not long. It did not need to be. The facts were plain enough on their own. He submitted it up the chain. Vreth Un read the first paragraph, noted who had written it, and filed it under low-priority administrative concerns. He told Sek Aro, or through a staff assistant, that the disruptions were the expected result of a primitive species making a spectacle of itself and that things would normalize once the theater was over. Sek Aro did not argue. He went back to his desk and quietly made a copy of his report for his own files. On day 14, a Keth-Ari maintenance technician was sent to inspect the power relay terminal at Junction Station Verath 7, which had started giving irregular readings. And the technician was experienced and thorough. She opened the access panel, pulled up the diagnostic interface, and stopped. Every label on every component inside the terminal was written in English. Not translated, not dual-labeled, English only in clean printed text, with small handwritten notes in the margins that were also in English, added by whoever had last serviced the unit. The technician stood there for a long moment, looking at the notes, at the neat, careful handwriting that belonged to someone she had never met and would never meet. She had no idea what any of it said. She closed the panel, filed a report marked urgent, and went to find a translator. There was not one available for another 3 days because the Human Translation Service office on Verath Prime had already been vacated and its contract with the Council had not yet been reassigned to anyone else. Carl Avery, back in Columbus, checked that item off his list, then poured a second cup of coffee and moved on to the next one. Kevin Marsh had been on Verath Prime for 3 years. He was a military liaison, which meant his job was to sit in rooms with alien defense officials and make sure that nothing accidentally became a war. It was less exciting than it sounded and more important than anyone admitted. He was good at it. He had a slow, easy way of talking that made tense people less tense. And he had spent 3 years learning the small things: which species needed silence before they could agree to something, which ones needed noise, which ones read hesitation as weakness, and which ones read it as respect. On day 18 of the withdrawal window, Kevin sat in a conference room on the station's military level and gave his final handover briefing. There were 6 alien officers in the room, representing 4 different species. They had worked alongside Kevin and his small human team for years. Some of them he liked very much. He had shared meals with a few of them, which was not a small thing when you were talking about species whose food requirements and social customs around eating were completely different from your own. He had made the effort because it mattered, and because it was the kind of thing that built the sort of quiet trust that kept mistakes from becoming disasters. And he went through the briefing document page by page. He explained every ongoing situation in detail. He had prepared notes on each conflict and each negotiation that the human liaison team had been managing. He answered every question carefully and completely, and when an officer from the Cathari delegation asked if humanity might reconsider its timeline, Kevin said, without any sharpness in his voice, that the timeline was firm. When it was done, he stood up. He shook hands with each of the 6 officers and picked up his bag. There was a silence in the room that was not comfortable. Kevin was almost at the door when the senior Shorvani officer, a quiet individual named Veltan, who had never said much in 3 years of meetings, spoke up. "Who will take the Duvari mediation when you are gone?" Veltan asked. It was a simple question. It was also the right question. Kevin turned around. "That's in the handover notes," he said. "Page 41. And the short answer is that no one on the current council roster is cleared for neutral arbitration in that corridor under the existing treaty framework. Your best option is to petition for a temporary ceasefire and use the time to build a new mediation structure." Veltan looked at him for a moment. "How long did it take your people to build the last one?" 11 years, Kevin said. He left. In the council chamber, things were not going well. The Duvari border situation had already been raised as an emergency item. The 2 species involved, the Atren and the Voska, had been holding an uneasy quiet for the past 2 years, largely because a small team of 4 human arbitrators had been maintaining near-constant back-channel communication with both sides. Those 4 people had packed their bags on day 15. By day 19, the back-channel had gone dark. By day 21, the first exchange of fire in 2 years was reported at the border. Ambassador Tay Liss of the Shorvani called for an emergency session. The Shorvani were not a powerful species in the council. They were small, careful, and deliberate, and they tended to speak infrequently, which meant that when they did speak, other delegates usually paid attention. Tay Liss was their senior ambassador and had been watching the past 18 days with growing dread. She stood at the central dais and she did not raise her voice. She simply started reading facts. She said that human medical nanite technology was currently in active use in 6 council species healthcare systems, and that the full maintenance and recalibration protocols existed only in human medical databases, which were no longer accessible to council members following the withdrawal of the Human Medical Exchange Agreement. She said that the universal translation matrix used by the council's own communication systems had been designed and built by a team of human linguists over 20 years, and that the ongoing updates and error corrections for that system had been provided by a human language bureau that had now closed its council contracts. She said that the fastest and most reliable hyperspace corridor in the Eastern Arm, the one used by 40% of council trade traffic, had been charted by a human survey team operating out of a ship registered to a city called Billings, Montana, and that the corridor's safety monitoring was handled by a human-operated station that had just filed its closure report. She went on for a while. The chamber was quieter than it usually was. The Vreth-Un listened to all of it with the expression of someone who had been told their house was on fire and had decided that the correct response was to question the reliability of the smoke. When Talis finished, he stood and said that the Shorvani ambassador was overstating the situation, that the council had 40 other member species and sufficient internal capacity to manage any disruptions caused by the departure of one minor member, and that it would not be appropriate to treat a diplomatic tantrum as though it were a genuine crisis. 5 other delegations nodded along. 2 did not. The vote to formally accept humanity's withdrawal from the council was called 2 days later. It passed 14-2. The 2 votes against were Shorvani and a small species called the Hivari, who had not said much during the debate, but who had been taking very careful notes. Vreth-Un announced the result with the tone of someone closing a minor administrative matter. Nathan Cole was not in the chamber for the vote. He was already on a transport ship, 2 days out from Vareth Prime, sitting near a window in the common area with a cup of tea that had gone cold while he was thinking. Laura sat across from him, reading something on a small screen. The stars outside were steady and quiet. "They voted it through," Laura said without looking up. She had been tracking the session remotely. "I know," Nathan said, 14-2. "I know." She looked up at him. "Are you okay?" Nathan looked at the cold tea in his hands. He thought about 60 years. He thought about 40 pages of careful, honest work laughed out of a chamber. He thought about the handwriting in the relay terminal margins, the notes left behind by some engineer whose name he probably knew, whose work had kept lights on across a dozen worlds. "I'm fine," he said. And he meant it in the way that people mean it when they are not fine, but have already accepted the thing that made them not fine, and are now simply moving forward. Outside, the stars did not move. The transport moved through them, steady and quiet, heading home. On the morning of day 31, Claire Donovan held a press conference. It was not in a grand hall. It was in a mid-sized room in a government building in Washington, and with a plain backdrop and a podium and about 60 journalists, some in person and some appearing on screens along the side wall. Claire was the Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, and she had been in that role for 9 years, and she was the person who had designed the withdrawal strategy from the beginning. Not the announcement, not the packing of boxes. The whole thing. The 4 years of preparation, the careful mapping of every human asset in council space, the quiet, unhurried decision that if the council would not treat humanity as an equal, then humanity would simply stop propping the council up. She stood at the podium, and she spoke plainly. She said that humanity's formal membership in the Interstellar Council had now ended. She said that all human personnel had been safely recalled and were either home or in transit. She said that Earth and the Sol Coalition remained open to diplomatic contact with all species, member or non-member of the Council, and on a bilateral basis. She said that humanity wished the Council well, sincerely, and had no interest in its failure. A journalist near the front asked if this was a victory. Claire thought about that for a moment. "We did what was right for our people," she said. "I'll leave it to historians to decide what to call it." She took 3 more questions, thanked the room, and left. Ben Hartley was in the back row. He was 26 years old and worked for a mid-sized independent news outlet, and he had been embedded with the government press pool for the past 2 weeks following the story. He was not the most experienced journalist in the room, but he was the one who, that evening, filed a piece that would eventually be read by more people than almost anything written that year. He called it Day 31. It was not about politics. It was about what he saw after the press conference, walking around the city. He wrote about a woman in a bakery in Northwest Washington who was frosting a cake and listening to the radio at low volume. He wrote about 2 kids on bikes near a school that had let out early, racing each other down a side street with no particular destination. He wrote about a man sitting outside a repair shop in the afternoon sun, drinking something from a thermos and watching traffic with the unhurried expression of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. He wrote, "Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was angry. The sun was out, and it was an ordinary Tuesday, and the people of Earth were simply living their lives, the way they always had, on a planet that had never needed the Council's approval to keep turning. It went everywhere. Meanwhile, the council's situation was getting worse in the way that slow problems get worse. Not with a single loud crack, but with 100 small ones. Each one easy to explain away on its own, impossible to ignore together. The medical crisis on the Keth Ari colony world of Varshet had started as a respiratory illness that affected about 300 people. It was not a dangerous disease by human standards. Humans had encountered a nearly identical pathogen 40 years earlier on a shared research station, had documented it thoroughly, and had developed a straightforward treatment protocol that was sitting in a database that was no longer accessible to council medical teams. The Keth Ari had their own doctors and their own medical systems. What they did not have was 2 centuries of interspecies medical research that human doctors had compiled out of a habit of caring about things that had nothing to do with them. That research had been shared freely with every council species through a medical exchange program that had been part of humanity's membership package. The program had been canceled on day 30. The outbreak grew, and the Trade Federation collapse was quieter but wider. There were 3 major neutral trade hubs in the inter-council territories, and all 3 had used a banking protocol designed and maintained by human financial systems engineers to handle currency exchange between species whose economic systems were not natively compatible. The protocol had been running for 30 years. It had never failed. And it was so stable that every trade agreement signed in the past 2 decades had simply assumed it would always be there. It was not there anymore. The hubs did not collapse immediately. They degraded, trade slowed. Disputes that would normally have been resolved through the neutral protocol had nowhere to go. Small agreements fell apart. Larger agreements that depended on small agreements being stable started to wobble. Sek Aro, who had been filing reports that no one was reading, finally did something he was not supposed to do. He found a contact address for a human trade official and sent a personal message. The official was Amy Rourke. She was 34, worked out of an office in Chicago, and had been handling incoming inquiries from non-council species for the past 3 weeks as part of the new bilateral outreach structure that Claire Donovan's office had set up. When Sek Aro's message arrived, she read it carefully. It was long and somewhat desperate in tone, and then it described the situation on the Keth Ari worlds, and the trade hubs, and the navigation failures, and the medical crisis, and asked, plainly and without any official framing, if there was anything humanity could do. Amy wrote back the same day. Her message was warm and professional and genuinely sympathetic. She said that she was sorry to hear about the difficulties and that she understood it was a hard situation. She said that Earth was very willing to discuss humanitarian aid and technical support requests, and that the process for doing so was through the new bilateral diplomatic channel that humanity had established for exactly this purpose. She attached the contact form and offered to personally move any serious requests to the front of the review queue. She included her direct line. Sek Aro stared at the message for a long time. He had expected coldness, or silence, or maybe something sharp. He had not expected kindness. It made him feel in a way he could not quite name, considerably worse about the past 2 months. Vreth-Un had not been sleeping well. On the evening of day 38, he sat in his private office and opened a file that had been submitted to his desk every year for 60 years as part of humanity's routine membership review. It documented all human contributions to the Council. Every project, every program, every service provided, every piece of infrastructure built or maintained. It was 14,000 pages long. He had never read it. None of the senior council members had. It had been filed, acknowledged with an automated receipt, and archived. Every year for 60 years. Vreth-Un read for 3 hours without stopping. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the wall for a very long time. Outside his window, Vareth Prime turned in the dark. See, its lights a little dimmer than usual because 2 of the power relay terminals at junction Varath 7 and Varath 11 were still running on reduced capacity, while the council waited for a maintenance team that knew what to do with English language wiring diagrams. The stars were the same as they had always been, but they felt somehow further away than they used to. Helix 7 was a neutral station. It had been built 40 years ago as a waypoint between three separate territorial zones. And nobody had ever gotten around to arguing about who owned it, so it had stayed neutral by default and gradually become the place where conversations happened that couldn't happen anywhere else. It smelled like recycled air and machine oil and the faint trace of 100 different kinds of food from 100 different kitchens, and its corridors were always a little too busy and a little too loud, and it was, in its own strange way, one of the most honest places in known space. Now, the council delegation arrived first. There were 11 of them. They came in formal dress, with full ceremonial markings and official seals on their travel documents, and they brought a support staff of 9 and 3 separate recording teams, because the Kethari in particular believed that important meetings should be documented in a way that reflected their importance. They filled the station's main conference suite completely. Humanity's delegation arrived 4 hours later. There were 3 of them, Claire Donovan, Amy Rourke, and Nathan Cole, who had technically retired 2 weeks earlier and was officially present as an observer and unofficially present because Claire had called him and said it would mean something, and he had agreed because she was right. They had one assistant between them, a quiet young man named Pete, who carried a single bag and said almost nothing. When the two sides sat down across from each other at the conference table, there was a moment of adjustment on the council side. 11 people and their support staff had expected a larger counterpart. They had prepared for a larger counterpart. The sight of 3 people, one of whom was retired, sitting down and arranging themselves with calm, unhurried ease, seemed to throw the room's balance off in a way that was hard to name. Vreth-Un opened the proceedings. He had clearly prepared for this. He spoke carefully, without his usual sharpness, and he laid out the council's offer in a measured and thorough way. Humanity would be welcomed back as a full member. Its status would be elevated to a senior-tier membership, which came with a larger delegation seat allocation, a position on 2 senior advisory committees, and a formal letter of recognition for 6 decades of contribution. The council acknowledged that the withdrawal had highlighted certain dependencies that needed to be reviewed, and it was committed to conducting that review through proper channels. It was, by any fair measure, a better offer than humanity had ever received from the council in 60 years of membership. Claire listened to every word of it without interrupting. When Vreth-Un finished, she nodded once, to show she had heard him, and then she reached into the bag that Pete had placed beside her chair, and she took out a document, and she slid it across the table. "Our counter-proposal," she said. Vreth-Un picked it up. He read the first page. He read the second page. The room stayed quiet. The document did not ask for revenge. It did not ask for ceremonies or elevated titles or symbolic letters. It asked for 3 things, clearly and specifically. First, it asked for equal vote weighting for all member species on all council decisions, replacing the current system that effectively gave the Keth-Ari and 2 other large species veto power over everything that mattered. Second, it asked for a mandatory annual review of all member contributions to council infrastructure, conducted publicly and put into the formal record, so that what had happened over the past 6 decades, a full accounting filed every year and never once read, could not happen again. Third, it asked for a humanitarian charter with actual enforcement capacity, covering all inhabited worlds in council space regardless of their membership status, including border worlds that happened to be caught between other people's wars. Vreth-Un looked up from the document. "This is not a return to membership," he said. "This is a restructuring of the entire council." "Yes," Claire said. "You are asking us to reduce our own authority." "We are asking you to share it." There was a silence. Vreth-Un set the document down. "This is an overreach," he said. "You left. You came back to negotiate re-entry. That is the nature of this meeting. You are not in a position to set conditions of this scale." Claire folded her hands on the table. She did not lean forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who did not need the other person to agree immediately or even soon. "With respect," she said, "we left once. We are not afraid to decline again." The silence that followed was different from the first one. It was the silence of a room in which everyone was doing math, and Amy sat very still beside Claire. She had spent the past 2 months answering desperate messages from Sec Aero and a dozen other mid-level council officials who had all eventually found her contact address through one channel or another. She had been kind and professional and helpful in every reply, and she had moved none of those requests forward faster than the process allowed. And in doing so, she had given every person she talked to a clear and repeated demonstration of exactly how unhurried Earth was prepared to be. She watched Vreth Un and waited. It was a Hevari delegate, one of the two who had voted against accepting the withdrawal, who moved first. She reached across the table, took the document from in front of Vreth Un, and read through it again slowly. Then she uncapped a pen and signed at the bottom. The Shorvani ambassador signed next. Then a delegate from the Durrani collective. Then 2 more in quick succession. Vreth Un watched them. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind it changed. The particular stiffness of someone who has been holding a position for a long time and has just felt it become impossible to hold. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he reached out and signed the document. The remaining delegates followed. Nathan Cole watched all of it from his chair at the far edge of the table. He had not said a word during the entire meeting. He had arrived, sat down, and been present, which was the only thing that had been asked of him. When Claire looked over at him after the last signature, he gave her a single small nod. It was not a triumphant expression. It was not quite satisfaction either. It was the look of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. The meeting wrapped up within the hour. The formal documents would take weeks to process, and there was a great deal of implementation work ahead, and nothing would be simple. But the signatures were on the page, and the page was real. On the transport back from Helix 7, Amy found a quiet corner near the back, took out her personal phone, and called home. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Hey," Amy said. "Yeah, it went well. I'll tell you all about it." She paused and listened for a moment. Then she smiled. "That sounds great," she said. "I'll be home by Thursday. Save me some." She hung up and looked out at the stars going past. They were the same stars that had always been there, steady and quiet and very far away, burning without asking anyone's permission, going about their business the way they always had, the way they always would. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, and was asleep before the station's lights had fully dimmed for the night cycle. Some things do not need a grand ending. They just need to be finished, and then life continues, and that is enough.